Everyone laughed when a simple female mechanic bought a rusty 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air for pennies. No one believed that this wreck would ever come back to life. But what she found inside the old car turned her whole life upside down and silenced everyone. Before you start, write in the comments which city you are watching us from. And if you like stories like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow there will be a new incredible story that you definitely won't want to miss. The mornings in Willow Creek always began the same way, with the distant hum of trucks rolling down the highway and the slow awakening of a town that had seen better days. For most people, those sounds blended into the background, but for Clara Jennings they carried a dull weight, like the reminder of something she could never quite reach. She was 33, her hands permanently stained with grease, her hair often tied back in a ragged bandana to keep it away from the sparks of her welding torch. Clara lived in a weather-worn house at the edge of town, next door to a garage that had been left to her when her uncle passed away. The building sagged in places, its roof patched with tin sheets that rattled when the wind picked up, but inside it still smelled of oil, hot steel, and old dreams. Every day followed a routine that had long since lost any shine. Clara opened the garage at dawn, rolled up the stubborn bay doors that creaked like aching bones, and waited for neighbors or strangers to bring in their tired cars. She worked on rusty pickups that farmers needed to keep alive for one more harvest, patched together minivans that had carried families long past their prime, and bent over compact sedans whose owners prayed would hold together until the next paycheck. She was good at what she did, better than anyone in town, but few noticed. Her work was invisible, taken for granted like the air people breathed. At the end of each day, she would wipe the sweat from her brow, shut off the flickering shop lights, and walk back to her empty house with nothing but fatigue and silence to keep her company. Despite the monotony, Clara carried a quiet pride. She had learned mechanics as a child, standing at her father's side when he still had the strength to hold a wrench, and later working with her uncle in this very garage. Machines made sense to her in a way people rarely did. An engine, no matter how broken, could be understood if you listened closely enough. It was people's doubts and her own loneliness that she could never quite repair. She often thought of her mother's words, whispered years ago before illness took her away. "You are capable of more than you know, Clara. Don't let the world convince you otherwise." Those words clung to her heart like a stubborn bolt, but over the years their echo grew faint. One Saturday, when the heat pressed down heavy and the town felt as though it had slowed to a crawl, Clara overheard two customers talking about a sale out on the edge of the county. A ranch had gone under, and the bank was liquidating everything: furniture, farm tools, livestock equipment, even vehicles that had been left to rust in the weeds. She felt a strange pull to go, though she had little reason to. She had no money to spend on luxuries, and her practical side told her she should stay home and rest. Still, curiosity stirred. Maybe it was the monotony gnawing at her soul, or maybe it was the faint whisper of her mother's voice urging her not to settle. The following morning, she drove her old pickup down cracked back roads until she reached the ranch. Dozens of people milled about the dusty yard, examining battered tractors and kitchen tables with missing legs. Clara walked slowly, taking in the scene, not really searching for anything. She told herself she was only there to look, but in truth she was hungry for a spark, something to jolt her out of the grayness of her routine. That was when she saw it. Half hidden in tall grass at the far edge of the property, beneath the shadow of a collapsed barn wall, rested the shell of a once glorious machine. Its paint had long since faded into a patchwork of dull blues and rust, its chrome dulled and pitted by decades of weather. The windshield was fractured, splintering light into crooked veins. The tires were flat, sunken into the earth as though the car had been trying to sink back into the soil that now claimed it. Yet even in that state of decay, there was no mistaking its identity. A Chevrolet Bel Air, 1957, one of the most iconic cars ever built in America's golden age of chrome and tail fins. Clara's breath caught. She approached slowly, each step crunching against gravel and weeds, her eyes tracing the curves of the body beneath layers of rust. The car was a corpse, and yet she felt as if it was still breathing, its soul waiting beneath the corrosion. She placed her palm against the hood, the metal hot from the sun, And in that touch, she felt a strange rush, like recognition. She didn't know why, but something inside her whispered that she couldn't leave it behind. Other bidders nearby laughed when the auctioneer dragged attention to the car. "That old junk heap," someone jeered, "belongs in the scrapyard." Another muttered that it would cost more to tow than it was worth. The auctioneer tried to start the bidding at a few hundred, but silence followed, broken only by snickers. Clara stood still, her heart pounding in her ears. Logic screamed at her to stay quiet. She didn't need another burden, certainly not a lifeless relic that would swallow every dime she had. But something deeper, something raw and unexplainable, urged her forward. Her hand went up before she could stop it. The auctioneer raised his eyebrows, clearly surprised. No one countered. With a slam of his gavel, the Bel Air was hers for almost nothing. As laughter echoed around her, Clara's face burned. But she did not back down. She had no idea how she would even get the car home, but the decision was already made. She wasn't buying a pile of rust. She was answering a call she hadn't known existed until that moment. Later that afternoon, a tow truck dragged the carcass of the Bel Air down the back roads toward Willow Creek. Clara followed behind in her pickup, nerves rattling in her chest. She wondered if she had lost her mind, if this impulsive purchase was nothing more than desperation disguised as courage. But each time the sunlight caught a glint of chrome beneath the rust, her doubt softened. When the tow truck finally backed into her garage and lowered the car onto the concrete, Clara stood frozen in the doorway. The old Chevrolet filled the bay like a sleeping giant, both broken and magnificent. The driver shook his head and muttered, "You sure this thing's worth dragging home?" Clara didn't answer. She saw what no one else did. She didn't see the crumbling seats, the shattered glass, or the weeds clinging stubbornly to the wheel wells. She saw the possibility of rebirth. She saw something that mirrored her own life, scarred, overlooked, but not beyond saving. That night, long after the sun slipped away and the crickets began their chorus, Clara remained in the garage. She turned off the lights and sat in silence with the car, its shadow looming over her like a guardian. She didn't touch a wrench, didn't pry open the hood, didn't try to assess the damage. She simply sat there, letting the enormity of her decision settle into her bones. For the first time in years, she felt the faint stirrings of something she thought she had lost: anticipation. The road ahead was uncertain, maybe even impossible, but she could sense that this car was more than metal and bolts. It was a forgotten road waiting to be walked again, a road that might just lead her out of the shadows of her small life. As the clock in her kitchen chimed midnight, Clara whispered a vow to herself, barely audible over the hum of summer cicadas. She would bring the Bel Air back to life, no matter what it cost her. She did not yet know that within its rusted frame lay not only the remnants of another family story, but also the key to rediscovering her own strength. For now it was enough to know she had taken the first step onto a forgotten road, and once her feet touched it, there could be no turning back. The following morning, Clara woke to the sound of silence heavier than usual. Her house seemed smaller than ever, crowded with doubts that had taken root overnight. She sat at the edge of her narrow bed, staring at the worn boots waiting by the door, her mind still replaying the moment the auctioneer's gavel had struck. The laughter of the crowd echoed in her ears, mocking her recklessness, reminding her that she had just spent what little she had on what everyone else saw as a pile of useless scrap. Yet beneath the weight of those doubts was something else, something she hadn't felt in years, an ember of anticipation, as though her life had suddenly tilted toward an unknown horizon. When she opened the garage, the sight waiting for her was both disheartening and magnetic. The Chevrolet Bel Air filled the bay, its hulking frame catching the first light of morning in muted, uneven flashes. Rust climbed across the doors like spreading veins, and the windshield's jagged crack looked like lightning frozen in glass. The tires were little more than sagging husks, and the chrome, once brilliant, had dulled to a weary gray. Clara stood for a long time in the doorway, her chest tightening at the enormity of what she had taken on. She felt almost foolish, as though the car itself were staring back at her, silently questioning whether she truly believed she could bring it back. Despite her hesitation, she crossed the oil-stained floor and pressed her palm against the hood. The metal was cool now, the heat of yesterday's sun long gone, but the sensation was the same as when she had first touched it. Beneath the decay, she felt a strange presence, a heartbeat hidden under layers of silence. With a deep breath, she whispered, "We'll see what you've got." She circled the car slowly, her mechanic's eye cataloging every flaw. The rear bumper hung loose, the trunk lock was jammed, and a faint smell of mildew seeped from the seams. She pulled the driver's door handle, and after a groan of resistance, it yielded, revealing a cabin that seemed more like a grave than a vehicle. The seats had split open, their stuffing spilling out like the insides of a wounded animal. The dashboard was cracked, its once polished surface warped and faded. Dust coated everything, dulling the remnants of color that might once have made the interior gleam. Clara lowered herself into the driver's seat, the springs groaning beneath her weight, and for a moment she tried to imagine what it had felt like decades ago, when the car was new, when someone slid behind this very wheel with excitement instead of dread. Her eyes fell to the glove compartment, half broken, its latch rusted but not fully sealed. She pried it open and found nothing but crumbling paper in a spider's nest. Shaking her head, she leaned back and glanced toward the rear. Something about the trunk nagged at her, a subtle difference in how the lid sat against the frame. She slid out, walked to the back, and tugged on the handle. It resisted at first, then gave with a sudden pop that sent flakes of rust tumbling to the floor. Inside, wedged among debris and the skeletal remains of a spare tire, was a battered suitcase, its leather cracked and discolored, its brass clasps tarnished with age. Clara froze. For a long moment she simply stared, her breath caught in her chest, as if she had uncovered something forbidden. With careful hands she lifted the suitcase free, setting it on the workbench where the morning light could touch it. The clasp, though worn, clicked open with surprising ease. Inside was a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, their edges yellowed and delicate, alongside a stack of photographs that smelled faintly of dust and time. She lifted the first photo, her fingers trembling slightly. A young couple stared back at her, smiling in front of a gleaming Chevrolet Bel Air, the same model now decaying before her. The man had his arm slung around the woman's shoulders, his face smeared with grease, as though he had been working on the car, while she held a picnic basket in one hand and shaded her eyes with the other. They looked radiant, full of hope, standing beside the car as though it were not merely transportation, but a symbol of everything they believed their future would hold. Clara's throat tightened as she set the photograph aside and reached for another. This one showed the couple again, perhaps a year later, with a child cradled in the woman's arms. The Bel Air was still there, gleaming behind them, its paint reflecting the sun like a mirror. Clara carefully unfolded one of the letters. The ink had faded but was still legible, the handwriting elegant and flowing. It was addressed from the man to his wife, speaking of plans to drive across the country, of seeing the ocean for the first time, of building a life full of roads and adventures. He wrote of saving money to add custom touches to the car, to make it truly theirs, a vessel for their dreams. Clara read in silence, her heart pounding as she absorbed the intimacy of their words. These weren't just papers. They were fragments of a life, preserved by accident in the trunk of a forgotten machine. Setting the letter down, Clara glanced back at the Bel Air. It no longer looked like a lifeless husk. It looked like a vessel, a silent witness to love and ambition that time had buried under rust. She brushed her hand over the photographs, then over the letters, and whispered to herself, "This was someone's dream." As the day wore on, she continued to sift through the suitcase. Some letters mentioned hard times, of bills piling up and promises delayed, yet always there was hope threaded through them, as though the car itself had been a beacon pulling them forward. There were postcards from towns far away, suggesting that at least some of their journeys had been realized. One note made Clara pause. "No matter how far we go, this car will always carry us together." She folded it carefully, her eyes stinging with emotion she didn't fully understand. The garage grew darker as the afternoon slipped into evening, but Clara barely noticed. She sat on the concrete floor, photographs spread around her, the suitcase open like a treasure chest. She felt the weight of history pressing against her shoulders, not in a way that burdened her, but in a way that gave her purpose. She realized then that restoring the Bel Air, could not be about selling it for profit or showing it off. To her, the car had become a promise. It was a story that deserved an ending, and she felt strangely chosen to be the one to write it. Exhaustion finally drove her back into the house, but even as she lay in bed, the images of the couple and their child lingered behind her eyelids. She wondered who they were, what had become of them, why the car had been left to rot. The questions swirled without answers, but they only deepened her resolve. She knew one thing with certainty. She could not let the car fade into oblivion. The next morning she rose earlier than usual, compelled by an energy she hadn't felt in years. When she stepped into the garage, the air was cool and still, the Bel Air looming quietly in the bay. But where yesterday she had seen only rust and ruin, today she saw layers of meaning. The car was not just junk. It was a time capsule, a vessel carrying the echoes of laughter, the weight of promises, and the silent endurance of love. She touched the hood again, more gently this time, as though acknowledging its hidden life. "We'll bring you back," she murmured. The words felt less like a statement and more like a vow. She imagined the young couple's voices lingering in the air, their hopes whispering through the cracks and dents. For the first time since her uncle's passing, for the first time since she had resigned herself to a life of quiet repair and routine, Clara felt alive. The Bel Air would not simply be another project. It would be her reckoning, her chance to prove not only to others, but to herself that within rust could be resurrection, within silence could be song. As the sun rose higher and lit the photographs still pinned to her workbench, Clara realized the decision she had made at the auction was no mistake. She had not bought junk. She had uncovered treasure, and that treasure was more than steel and chrome. It was the story of lives once lived, and the possibility of reclaiming something the world had forgotten. The road ahead would not be easy. She could already feel the weight of the work waiting for her, the grinding, the welding, the endless search for parts, the countless nights she would spend alone in the garage. Yet none of it frightened her now. The laughter of those who had mocked her at the auction faded from memory, replaced by the quiet conviction that some things were worth more than common sense. Clara had found not just a car, but a calling, and with that calling, the forgotten road beneath her feet began to stretch forward, waiting for her to follow it wherever it might lead. The days that followed took on a rhythm that felt different from the weary routine that had defined Clara's life for so long. Each morning she entered the garage, no longer dragging her feet, but with a cautious eagerness, as though something within her had awakened. The Bel Air waited in the bay, its body hulking and rusted, but no longer just a corpse. It seemed to watch her as she pulled on her gloves and set down her coffee, as if challenging her to begin the long and brutal process of giving it back the dignity it once carried. The suitcase and its contents remained on the workbench, photographs carefully stacked, letters folded neatly into a tin box she had found to protect them from further decay. Sometimes she caught herself staring at them before she began her work, drawing strength from the smiling faces of the couple who had once leaned against the car's gleaming fenders. They had dreamed of roads untraveled, of journeys incomplete, and Clara told herself that she would not let their dream die under the weight of time and neglect. The first step was the most unforgiving. She began with the interior, pulling away what had long since ceased to be usable. The seats crumbled under her grip, stuffing falling apart into dusty clumps that smelled of mildew and age. She worked slowly, stripping out the old carpet, which disintegrated in her hands, revealing a floor pan corroded with patches of rust. It was worse than she had anticipated, and for a brief moment doubt clawed at her stomach. She paused, sweat stinging her brow even in the cool of the morning, and considered whether she had truly taken on something far beyond her ability. But the doubts did not last. She straightened her back, tightened her grip, and carried the ruined materials outside, piling them up beside the garage like offerings to some stubborn god of machines. She moved next to the dashboard, each turn of her screwdriver revealing more decay. Dust clung to her face and hair as she pried away cracked panels and corroded knobs. Her fingers bled more than once when jagged edges caught her skin, but she pressed on, wiping the blood on her coveralls as if it were nothing more than grease. By evening, the Bel Air's interior was stripped bare, reduced to metal bones and shadows. The sight was brutal, but there was also a kind of beauty in it. She could see the raw skeleton of the car now, a foundation waiting to be rebuilt. Nights grew longer in the garage. Clara often worked by the weak glow of a lamp that buzzed faintly, its light barely cutting through the gloom. Her house sat empty behind her, quiet and lifeless. But in the garage there was motion, sound, and purpose. She scavenged what she could from scrapyards, pulling seats and trim from other forgotten cars, most of which were too far gone, but sometimes offered a hinge or a fragment of chrome worth saving. Money was tight, tighter than ever, and each purchase gnawed at her savings. But she learned to bargain, to trade her labor for parts when cash would not stretch far enough. She fixed a farmer's tractor in exchange for a set of old tools, replaced the brakes on a neighbor's truck in return for an untouched radio that had sat in a barn since the 60s. Slowly, the pieces began to accumulate, though the progress seemed invisible to anyone but her. The town whispered. Clara knew it. She overheard the remarks at the diner, the skepticism in the parts store, the sideways glances when she drove through town with her pickup loaded down with more rust than treasure. "She's wasting her time," one man said, loud enough for her to hear. Another chuckled. "That car'll never see the road again. She's just digging her own grave with it." Clara pretended not to notice, but the words lodged deep. At night, when exhaustion overtook her and her body ached in every joint, those doubts crept back. She would sit on the edge of her workbench, staring at the gutted Bel Air, and wonder if she was simply trying to resurrect something beyond saving, not only in the car, but in herself. It was then, during one of those nights when her determination wavered, that her eyes fell again on the photographs pinned to the wall above her tool rack. The couple's smiles glowed faintly in the lamplight, frozen in a joy that no rust could erase. She studied the lines of their faces, the tilt of their heads, the way the man's hand rested protectively at the woman's waist. She thought of the letter that had spoken of reaching the ocean one day, of the promise that this car would carry them together wherever they wished to go. Clara inhaled slowly, letting the image burn into her memory, and felt a flicker of resolve return. If they could believe in the car as a vessel for their dreams, then so could she. She had already come too far to surrender to doubt. The following days became an unbroken cycle of work, sweat, and stubbornness. Clara pulled the hood open and stared down into the engine bay for the first time since bringing the car home. The sight nearly broke her. The V8 that had once been the pride of the Bel Air sat frozen, coated in rust and grime, its oil hardened into tar, its pistons seized. A bird's nest filled the air filter housing, twigs and feathers mocking the silence of the machine beneath. Clara let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head, but then rolled up her sleeves and began. She drained what remained of the old fluids, each one pouring out like black sludge. She scrubbed and pried, cleaned and cursed, working inch by inch, as though fighting against time itself. The process was endless, but in the rhythm of it, she found a strange comfort. The sound of her tools became music, the scrape of wire brushes and the clang of dropped wrenches filling the air, where once there had been only silence. Her knuckles bruised and cracked, her nails blackened, and yet each small victory, the turning of a bolt that had been frozen for decades, the discovery of a gear still intact beneath the grime fueled her spirit. Slowly, the engine began to reveal itself, not as a corpse, but as a challenge. Clara's evenings stretched late into the night, and her mornings came too quickly. Coffee became her constant companion, bitter and thin, gulped down between tasks. Her body protested, shoulders stiff, back sore, but she pushed through, driven by a need she could not explain even to herself. The town might see nothing but a broken car and a foolish woman, but in the solitude of her garage she was building something larger than herself, something that tethered her to the past and pulled her toward a future she had not dared to imagine. One evening, as the sun bled red through the windows and cast long shadows across the concrete floor, Clara stepped back from the Bel Air and studied what she had done. The interior was gone, stripped down to bare metal. The engine bay, though still silent, had been cleaned of years of filth. The car looked more skeletal than ever, but in that rawness she saw possibility. She brushed the sweat from her forehead, leaving a streak of grease behind, and allowed herself a rare smile. It was only the first step, but it was a step all the same. Later, when exhaustion forced her to sit at the workbench, she picked up one of the letters again. Her fingers traced the fading ink as she read about the couple's plans to drive across states, to see mountains and oceans they had only imagined. She whispered the words aloud, her voice barely audible in the empty garage, as though reciting a prayer. The letters were no longer relics to her. They were fuel, as essential as the gasoline the car would one day drink again. They reminded her that this was not only about restoring a machine, but about restoring a dream. As she turned off the lights that night, Clara looked back one last time. The Bel Air stood stripped and silent, but to her it already seemed changed. It was no longer just an artifact of the past, no longer just a burden she had foolishly purchased. It was a partner now, demanding and relentless, but alive in a way she had not expected. She felt the connection deepening, like a bond forged not from logic but from shared resilience. She closed the door behind her and stepped into the cool night air, her body aching, yet her spirit restless. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of forward motion, of being pulled towards something greater than the sum of her days. The road ahead was long and brutal, but she no longer feared it. The first steps had been taken, and once those steps began, there could be no turning back. Clara had grown accustomed to the loneliness of her garage, to the hours where the only sounds were the clatter of wrenches and the occasional hiss of a torch. It had been her life for years, a rhythm she understood, even if it often left her hollow. But something began to shift in the weeks after she stripped the Bel Air to its bones. The car had become the center of her world, and in ways she didn't anticipate, it started to pull others into its orbit. It began on a quiet afternoon, when Clara was crouched under the car, her hands slick with oil as she fought to loosen a rusted bolt from the rear axle. The door to the garage creaked open, letting in a wedge of sunlight, and she assumed it was a customer bringing in a routine job. Without looking up, she muttered a greeting, only to hear a hesitant voice that didn't match the usual crowd. "You really working on that old Chevy?" She slid out from beneath the chassis, blinking at the sudden glare. Standing there was a boy, no more than 16, with shaggy hair that fell into his eyes and a restless energy that seemed barely contained. Clara wiped her hands on a rag and nodded. "That's the plan." The boy's gaze drifted to the stripped-down frame, to the bare metal and dangling wires, and for a moment his expression was skeptical, but then something flickered in his eyes, a mixture of curiosity and challenge. "Can I watch?" he asked, his voice almost defiant, as though daring her to refuse. Clara studied him for a moment, recognizing in him a restlessness she knew well. She shrugged. "If you don't mind dirt and grease, sure." From that day on, the boy whose name was Evan began to appear more and more often. At first he lingered at the edges, asking questions in a cautious voice, watching her every move with the intensity of someone starving to learn. Then when Clara finally handed him a wrench and told him to try loosening a bolt himself, his whole demeanor changed. His clumsy hands fumbled at first, but the pride that lit his face when the bolt finally gave way was unmistakable. Clara saw in him a reflection of herself at that age, eager for purpose, hungry to prove he was capable of more than anyone expected. Not long after Evan's arrival, another figure appeared at the garage. Mr. Dalton, an older man with weathered hands and a limp that spoke of long years spent on factory floors, had once worked at the General Motors plant 2 towns over. He had been retired for years, his days spent tending a small garden and sipping coffee at the diner. But when word reached him that Clara Jennings had dragged a '57 Bel Air into her garage, something stirred in him. One morning, Clara looked up from her work to find him standing in the doorway, his cap pulled low, his expression both skeptical and intrigued. "You're really going to bring that old thing back?" he asked, his voice carrying a weight of history. Clara simply nodded, unsure if he meant it as a challenge or an offer. Dalton stepped closer, running his calloused hand along the edge of the hood, his eyes clouded with memory. "Built engines like this for 20 years, he murmured. "Knew every bolt, every piston. Haven't touched one in a long time." There was a silence between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Finally, Clara spoke. "You want to help?" Dalton looked at her for a long moment, and then, with the faintest smile, he nodded. With Dalton's presence, the work began to take on a new rhythm. He moved slower than he once had, but his knowledge ran deep, and Clara quickly realized she was learning as much from him as she was teaching Evan. Together they disassembled the engine piece by piece, Dalton's voice low and steady as he explained the subtleties of each part, Evan watching wide-eyed as though witnessing magic. Clara felt the weight of the work lighten, not because it was easier, but because it was no longer hers alone. The garage, once a place of solitude, began to hum with voices, laughter, and the clinking of tools passed from hand to hand. Then came the painter. His name was Miguel, a local artist known for murals on brick walls downtown, bursts of color that transformed empty alleys into galleries. He arrived one evening after hearing rumors about Clara's project. Standing in the doorway, he looked out of place in his paint-splattered jeans and ink-stained fingers. But his eyes lit up when they fell on the Bel Air's shell. "This car," he said almost reverently, "is a canvas." Clara frowned, skeptical of what he meant, but Miguel explained his vision. Once the body was restored, he wanted to lay a design across its curves, something that honored its past and gave it a voice for the future. At first, Clara resisted. To her, the restoration was about returning the car to life, about honoring the history in the letters and photographs she had found. The idea of covering it with paint seemed almost sacrilegious, but Miguel showed her sketches he had drawn, inspired by the photos of the couple she had pinned on the wall. The designs weren't wild graffiti or careless splashes of color. They were tributes, flowing lines that seemed to echo the language of memory, subtle patterns that would make the car unique while still respecting its soul. Clara studied the sketches, torn between her instinct to preserve and the realization that perhaps Miguel's vision was exactly what the car needed, to carry not just the past but also a new future. In the end, she agreed, though she warned him it would be months before the body was ready for his touch. Word spread slowly through Willow Creek. Neighbors who once laughed at her foolish purchase began to wander into the garage, curiosity piqued by the sight of the Bel Air stripped down and slowly coming back to form. Some brought small offerings, a box of donuts, a handful of old tools, even a spare part or two that had been gathering dust in a shed. They stayed for an hour or an afternoon, and though few knew much about mechanics, their presence filled the air with something Clara had not felt in years: community. The work itself remained grueling. Clara's hands were perpetually bruised, her coveralls stiff with stains that no washing could remove. Nights stretched late, exhaustion clung to her bones, and yet she found herself smiling more often than not. Watching Evan's face light up when he learned to weld his first seam, listening to Dalton's stories of the assembly line, seeing Miguel sketch designs across the workbench with charcoal smudges on his fingertips, all of it reminded her that she was no longer alone. One evening, after hours of grinding and sanding, Clara sat on a stool at the edge of the garage, her body aching with fatigue. She looked around the space that had once been silent and lonely. Evan was sweeping the floor, humming off-key. Dalton sat in a chair, sipping coffee, his eyes distant with memory but peaceful. Miguel leaned against the wall, sketchbook in hand, lines flowing across the page as though guided by some unseen hand. Clara felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. She had spent years thinking she had nothing to offer beyond her skill with engines, that her life would remain small and solitary. But here, around the carcass of a car that others had dismissed as junk, something was being built that was larger than steel or chrome. As she turned back to the Bel Air, its frame now cleaner, its body beginning to take shape, she realized that the car was no longer just hers. It belonged to all of them now: Evan with his restless curiosity, Dalton with his decades of wisdom, Miguel with his vision of art, and the neighbors who had brought food, tools, or simply their presence. The laughter that had followed her from the auction faded from her mind, replaced by the hum of voices and the spark of possibility. That night, long after the others had gone home, Clara stayed behind in the quiet garage. She sat in the driver's seat, staring through the empty windshield at the darkened road outside. She rested her hands on the wheel, though it was cracked and useless, and let the silence wash over her. For the first time in a long while, she did not feel weary. She felt something else entirely, something fragile but undeniable: hope. The Bel Air, stripped and waiting, seemed to mirror her own transformation. She had started this journey alone, convinced it would be a battle she fought in silence. Yet here she was, surrounded by allies she had not expected, each of them drawn to the car for reasons she could not entirely explain. Perhaps, she thought, the car carried more than memory in its rusting frame. Perhaps it carried the power to bring people together, to remind them that even the most broken things could still have meaning. She closed her eyes for a moment, her fingers tracing the outline of the steering wheel. The garage smelled of oil and dust and faint traces of paint. Outside, the cicadas sang, their chorus drifting in through the open bay doors. Clara inhaled deeply and let the weight of the moment settle into her chest. The journey ahead was still daunting, the road long and uncertain, but she was no longer walking it alone. Sparks of support had been struck, and from those sparks, she felt, a fire was beginning to grow. The garage no longer felt like the quiet, hollow space it had once been. With Evan's restless energy, Dalton's slow wisdom, and Miguel's bursts of artistic vision, it had become a place alive with voices and movement. Yet even with that support, Clara soon discovered that some battles had to be fought alone. The deeper they pushed into the restoration, the more impossible the Bel Air seemed. It was one thing to strip away rust, to clean and polish, to replace what could be replaced. It was another to breathe life back into a machine that had been silent for decades. The engine block, which Dalton had insisted on dismantling piece by piece, turned out to be a battlefield. Each part they pulled revealed another layer of corrosion, another fracture too deep to ignore. The pistons were scarred beyond repair, the crankshaft pitted, the cylinder walls eaten by rust. Dalton's jaw tightened as he examined them, and Clara recognized the unspoken truth in his eyes. Some things were too far gone. She refused to admit it, even as the weight of that truth settled heavily in her chest. Money had always been a shadow in her life, but now it loomed larger than ever. The cost of sourcing replacement parts, when they could even be found, was staggering. She worked double hours on customer cars, taking jobs she normally would have turned away, patching together worn-out engines and bent frames just to scrape together enough to keep going. Her hands shook some nights from exhaustion, the skin on her knuckles splitting open, but she told no one. Evan saw the bruises, Dalton saw the fatigue in her eyes, Miguel saw the way she sometimes lingered too long in silence. But Clara brushed away their concern with the stubbornness of someone who had decided that surrender was not an option. There were nights when she wanted to walk away. She would stand at the edge of the garage, staring at the skeletal frame of the Bel Air, and feel the weight of every dollar she had poured into it pressing down on her chest. She thought of her uncle's voice, warning her not to let dreams cloud judgment, of her mother's words about being capable of more, and felt torn between those two ghosts. Her life could have been simpler if she had never raised her hand at that auction, never let herself believe that rust could hold meaning. The laughter of the townspeople still echoed in her mind, reminding her of how foolish they thought she was. Sometimes in the quietest hours of the night, she feared they were right. One evening, when the air was thick with summer heat and the cicadas sang their relentless chorus, Clara sat alone on the garage floor, her back pressed against a tool chest. The others had gone home hours earlier, leaving her with only the whisper of cooling metal. She opened the tin box where she had stored the letters from the suitcase, her hands trembling as she pulled one free. The paper was fragile, edges worn thin, but the words were still clear. It was a letter from the man to his wife, dated decades ago. He wrote of working extra shifts, of saving every penny, of dreaming of the day when they would take the car west to see the ocean. He admitted to being tired, to feeling crushed beneath the weight of obligations, but he ended the letter with a promise. This car will carry us to places we've never seen, no matter how hard it gets. Clara's throat tightened as she read those words aloud into the silence. The garage seemed to hold its breath, as though listening. She pressed the letter against her chest and closed her eyes. If he could cling to hope in the midst of his struggles, then so could she. The tears that slipped down her face left streaks on her cheeks, mixing with the grime of the day. But she did not wipe them away. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she was doing, not just the burden, but the meaning. This was not about money or even about the car itself. It was about carrying forward a dream that had been left unfinished, about honoring the voices of those who had once believed in something greater than themselves. The following morning, she rose before dawn and returned to the garage with a renewed determination. She pulled the tarp off the Bel Air and set to work with a ferocity that startled even Evan when he arrived later. She attacked the rust with grinders, sparks flying like fireflies into the dim light, the noise echoing through the space like defiance. She scoured every inch of the frame, refusing to leave even a trace of decay. Dalton watched silently, nodding in quiet approval, while Miguel set down his sketches and began sanding panels alongside her. Still, progress was slow, and the costs continued to mount. Clara sold off what little she had of value: her uncle's old collection of tools, a vintage motorcycle that had been gathering dust in the corner of the garage, even a set of her father's heirloom watches that she had once sworn never to part with. Each sale cut deep, each loss a reminder of how much she was sacrificing. Yet with every piece she let go, the car grew closer to life. It felt as though she was trading fragments of her past for the possibility of a future, giving up relics that meant something to her in exchange for something that meant even more. There were setbacks that nearly broke her resolve. A shipment of replacement parts arrived damaged, costing her weeks of work and money she couldn't spare. A fire sparked one night when a faulty wire touched the fuel line, nearly consuming the entire project before Evan's quick thinking smothered the flames. And always there was the endless exhaustion, the kind that seeped into her bones and whispered that no amount of effort would ever be enough. But each time she faltered, she returned to the letters, to the photographs pinned above her workbench. They were her compass, her reminder that this was not just her fight. The town's laughter had quieted now. People still shook their heads, but some of them began to look with curiosity rather than scorn. A few stopped by to watch her work, lingering at the doorway before slipping away without a word. Clara noticed, though she pretended not to. She knew that something had shifted. What once seemed like folly was becoming, slowly, a source of wonder. Late one night, when the garage was bathed in the soft glow of a single lamp, Clara stood over the stripped frame of the Bel Air and placed her hands on its cold steel. Her fingers traced the lines of the body, the curves dulled by years but still elegant, still proud. She whispered into the silence, not sure if she was speaking to the car, to the couple whose letters she kept close, or to herself. "We're not giving up. Not now. Not ever." The words echoed faintly, absorbed by the concrete walls, but in her heart they burned like fire. The price of the journey was higher than she had ever imagined. It demanded her time, her strength, her money, and even pieces of her past. But with each sacrifice, she felt something new taking root within her, something stronger than fear or doubt. It was conviction. It was the belief that some dreams, no matter how old or broken, were worth saving. And so she worked on, through exhaustion, through setbacks, through nights when her hands trembled too much to hold a wrench steady. She worked because she had no choice anymore. The Bel Air was no longer just a car, it was a promise. And Clara Jennings was not about to let a promise die. The long nights bled into one another until Clara sometimes lost track of the days. She woke with aching hands and stiff joints, moved through the garage with a kind of half-dreaming focus, and only realized how much time had passed when the sun sank or rose beyond the dusty windows. Yet despite the exhaustion, she felt the tide beginning to turn. The endless stripping away, the scraping and cleaning, the bleeding knuckles and broken bolts, all of it had carved a space for something new to rise. The Bel Air was no longer a husk. It was beginning to take shape, and with it, Clara herself began to change. It started with the frame. Weeks of grinding had eaten away at the rust, and with Dalton's steady hand guiding her, she had learned to weld patches into the corroded floor pan until it held strong again. She remembered the first time they lowered the car onto its wheels without fear of collapse. The tires were temporary, old replacements that squealed against the concrete, but the sight of the car sitting square and proud nearly brought her to tears. She leaned against the workbench that night, her chest heaving with relief, and whispered to the letters on the wall that they were closer now, closer to fulfilling the promise buried in their ink. The engine was the greatest trial. Piece by piece, Dalton and Clara rebuilt it, cleaning every surface, measuring every tolerance. Evan hovered nearby, wide-eyed, holding tools when asked, his questions spilling out faster than Clara could answer. She saw in him the same hunger she had once carried as a child when she first watched her uncle work. Together they rebuilt the heart of the car, sleepless nights spent bent over greasy parts until the lines of their fingerprints blurred into oil stains. And when at last the block was clean and the pistons sat in place, Dalton's voice grew husky. "Looks like it wants to live again." Clara nodded, afraid to speak, afraid to shatter the fragile hope that hovered in the air. The first time they turned the key, the garage seemed to hold its breath. The engine groaned, stuttered, and then fell silent. Evans swore under his breath. Miguel, who had put down his charcoal sketches to watch, clutched his notebook like a prayer. Clara's jaw tightened as she adjusted the choke, checked the fuel line, and tried again. The second attempt rattled the walls with a cough of smoke. Then another silence. Her shoulders slumped, despair threatening to undo her. But Dalton put a hand on her shoulder, steady and grounding. "One more time," he said. Clara twisted the key, and with a roar that seemed to shake the foundations of the earth, the Bel Air's engine came to life. It was not smooth, not perfect. Its growl was uneven, coughing out bursts of smoke, rattling with the weight of years. But it was alive. The sound filled the garage like thunder, and for a moment no one moved. Then Evan let out a cheer so loud it startled Miguel, and Clara laughed through the tears streaking her face. She leaned against the fender, her whole body trembling, as the vibrations from the engine pulsed into her bones. The car was breathing again, and with it, something inside her heart had woken fully. After that, progress gathered momentum. The body panels were sanded until the dull, scarred surfaces revealed their original steel. Miguel's sketches began to take form on tracing paper, his designs now shaped by the lines of the car itself. He spoke of honoring the past, of echoing the curves with patterns that would shimmer like memory. And for the first time, Clara felt no resistance. She wanted the car not just restored, but reborn, carrying both the history it had held and the future it could now embody. The day they painted the body was one Clara would never forget. The old garage was transformed into a makeshift booth, plastic sheeting draped along the walls, the air thick with the smell of primer and paint. Miguel mixed the colors himself, a deep, haunting red with metallic undertones that seemed to glow even under the harsh fluorescent lights. They worked together, layer by layer, the spray gun hissing as the new skin spread across the car. When at last the final coat dried, Clara stepped back, her breath caught in her throat. The Bel Air no longer looked like a relic dragged from the weeds. It gleamed, proud and defiant, like a legend reborn. Inside, the transformation continued. Clara and Evan installed new seats, upholstered in soft leather that carried the faintest scent of promise. The dashboard was carefully restored, its chrome polished until it reflected their faces, tired but triumphant. They rewired the gauges, fixed the knobs, and when the lights flickered to life across the dash, Evan let out a whoop that echoed through the shop. Clara only smiled, her hands trembling as she rested them on the steering wheel, feeling its weight as though it were alive. Neighbors began to gather, drawn by the sound of tools and the whispers that had spread through town. They peeked into the garage, at first with cautious skepticism, then with wide-eyed wonder. They saw the car that had once been dismissed as junk now gleaming like a jewel, and they brought with them food, encouragement, and even the occasional part dug out of a forgotten shed. What had started as Clara's lonely crusade was now a communal resurrection. People came not because they loved cars, but because they saw in Clara's work something that spoke to them, the refusal to give up on what others called hopeless. Clara felt the shift inside herself as much as she saw it in those around her. The weariness was still there, the sacrifices still heavy, but her shoulders no longer sagged beneath the weight. She walked taller, her voice steadier, her heart steadier still. The woman who once doubted her worth now stood in the center of a garage filled with life, guiding hands younger and older than her own, orchestrating the rebirth of a machine that had become more than steel. The final moment of triumph came late one night, long after the others had gone home. Clara slid into the driver's seat, the upholstery firm beneath her, the smell of fresh leather and paint filling her lungs. The dash lights glowed softly, the steering wheel cool beneath her palms. She turned the key and the engine roared, not with the coughs and stutters of before, but with a smooth, steady growl that sent shivers down her spine. She closed her eyes, listening to the music of it, and whispered, "You're back." Outside, the town slept, unaware that history had been rewritten in a small garage on the edge of Willow Creek. But Clara knew. She knew that the Bel Air was no longer just a car. It was a legend, resurrected from the grave, carrying with it the voices of the past and the strength of those who had refused to let it die. And as she sat in the glow of the dashboard, her hands steady on the wheel, she realized that she too had been resurrected. She was no longer the woman trapped in routine, doubting her worth. She was the builder of something greater, the keeper of memory, the creator of hope. The night stretched on, but Clara did not feel the hours pass. She sat in the driver's seat until the first light of dawn filtered through the garage windows, the car idling softly like a heartbeat beside her. When the sun finally rose, its rays caught the deep red paint, and for a fleeting moment the Bel Air seemed to shimmer with life, as though the couple from the photographs were still there, smiling, ready to climb in and take the road they had once dreamed of. Clara smiled through tears she could not stop. The resurrection was complete. The legend lived again. The night of the resurrection lingered in Clara's bones long after the dawn had come and gone. For days she moved through her garage with the sensation that she had crossed a threshold and left her old self behind. The Bel Air now stood in the center of the shop like a monument, polished to a deep, haunting red that glowed even in the dimmest light, its chrome gleaming like captured sunlight. It no longer seemed like a project or a dream half-formed. It was whole, alive, a legend reborn from rust and silence. Yet Clara knew that one last step remained. The car was meant to move, to roll down the roads it had once been promised, and until she drove it out of the garage, the journey would not be complete. That morning, Clara rose before the sun and dressed in her coveralls, though there was no real work left to do. She walked into the garage and paused in the doorway, letting her eyes settle on the Bel Air. For a long time she simply stood there, the air heavy with the scent of paint, leather, and gasoline, and felt the weight of all the hours that had brought her to this moment. She thought of the boy and the woman in the photographs, their smiles frozen in time, their hopes folded into letters that had survived decades. She thought of Dalton's steady hands guiding her, of Evan's restless determination, of Miguel's vision laid across the curves of the car. She thought of the sacrifices, the exhaustion, the nights when she had nearly surrendered, and of how far she had come since then. When she slid into the driver's seat, her heart pounded as though she were about to step onto a stage. The upholstery creaked softly under her weight, new yet familiar, and the dash lights glowed faintly when she turned the key. For a moment she sat in silence, her hands resting on the wheel, and then with a steady breath she twisted her wrist. The engine roared to life, smooth and full, its voice echoing through the garage like a declaration. Clara closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. It was not just the rumble of pistons and fuel. It was the sound of survival, of dreams carried forward through time, of memory and hope welded together into steel. She eased the car into gear and the tires rolled slowly, carrying the Bel Air across the concrete floor and toward the open bay doors. Outside, the sun had just risen, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The car moved with surprising grace, its weight balanced, its engine humming with confidence. Clara guided it onto the road, her pulse quickening as the wheels touched asphalt for the first time in decades. The moment felt sacred, as though the whole town held its breath, even if most of it still slept. She drove through familiar streets that suddenly seemed transformed. The houses, the diner, the church steeple all looked different through the windshield of the Bel Air, as though she were seeing them with new eyes. People turned their heads as she passed, their expressions shifting from disbelief to awe. Some raised their hands in greeting, others simply stared. But Clara felt none of the sting she had once felt when the town's laughter followed her. This time she felt pride, not for their approval, but for what she had accomplished in spite of their doubts. Her route took her past the high school, where Evan had once loitered with restless boredom before the garage had given him purpose. It carried her past Dalton's small house, its garden blooming quietly, a reflection of his patience and care. She passed Miguel's mural downtown, a riot of color spread across brick, and thought of how his art would one day flow across the body of the car in patterns of memory. Each landmark reminded her that she had not walked this road alone. Finally, Clara drove to the outskirts of town, where the asphalt opened into long, winding stretches of countryside. She pressed the accelerator gently, and the Bel Air surged forward with a strength that sent tears stinging her eyes. The wind rushed through the open window, carrying the smell of fields and sun-warmed earth, and for the first time in years, she felt utterly free. The road stretched out before her, endless and inviting, a ribbon of possibility unfurling toward the horizon. She whispered into the rush of air, "We made it." When she returned to Willow Creek later that day, a small crowd had gathered outside the garage. Word had spread quickly, and people came not just to see the car, but to witness the proof that something once written off as worthless could shine again. Children ran their fingers along the gleaming paint, their parents watching with quiet reverence. Veterans lingered near the fenders, nodding as though recognizing a piece of their own past in the lines of the car. Widows smiled through tears, touched by the sight of memory restored. Clara stood among them, humbled and proud, her heart full as she watched the car become more than hers. It belonged now to everyone who needed a reminder that hope was never truly lost. In the weeks that followed, life in the garage shifted once more. Clara began to take on projects she never would have dared before, cars with stories of their own, machines abandoned but not forgotten. She taught Evan not only how to weld and repair, but how to believe in himself. Dalton continued to sit at her side, his wisdom now softened by the peace of seeing his knowledge passed on. Miguel began preparing for the day when his designs would be painted onto the Bel Air, turning it into a moving canvas of remembrance. The garage became more than a place of labor. It became a sanctuary for those who believed in second chances. Yet the Bel Air remained the heart of it all, parked proudly at the front of the shop, gleaming even when dust settled around it. Clara often caught herself staring at it in quiet moments, tracing the initials she had hidden in the chrome, whispering silent conversations with the couple whose letters still sat carefully preserved on her desk. One evening, she framed one of those letters and hung it on the wall above her workbench. It was the one that spoke of reaching the ocean, of refusing to give up no matter how hard the road became. She read it often, letting its words steady her whenever fatigue threatened to overwhelm her. Months later, when the leaves turned gold and the air grew crisp, Clara decided it was time to take the Bel Air on a longer journey. She packed a small bag, filled the tank, and set off alone down the highway, heading west. The road carried her through towns she had never seen, past fields and rivers and mountains that reminded her of the postcards tucked in the suitcase. At last she reached the ocean, its vastness spreading before her, waves crashing with a force that felt eternal. She parked the car by the shore, climbed onto the hood, and sat with the wind in her hair and the salt on her lips. Looking out across the endless water, she whispered, "We did it," knowing the words were not only for herself, but for those who had once dreamed of this moment and never lived to see it. When she finally returned to Willow Creek, the garage awaited her, buzzing with the rhythm of life. Evan was already working on a Firebird, Dalton polishing a wrench, Miguel sketching designs across a spare panel. Clara stepped inside, the sound of laughter greeting her, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest. She was no longer the woman who had once moved through her days in silence, fixing other people's broken things just to survive. She was someone who had rebuilt not only a car, but a life, a community, and a belief in herself. That evening, after the others had gone, Clara sat once more in the Bel Air's driver's seat. The shop was quiet, the only light a single lamp casting a soft glow across the chrome. The St. Christopher medal she had found in the suitcase hung from the rearview mirror, swaying gently in the still air. She rested her hand on the wheel, closed her eyes, and breathed deeply. The car purred beneath her, steady and alive, and she knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The open road would always call to her, not as an escape, but as a reminder that there was always more to see, more to build, more to hope for. And as long as she kept moving forward, she would carry with her the knowledge that even the most broken things could be made whole again. The Bel Air was proof of that. She herself was proof of that. And for Clara Jennings, the road was no longer something to fear. It was the place where everything truly began. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. We've got even more powerful stories waiting for you. Just click on one of the videos right here and keep the journey going. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share this video with them now. You'll be glad you did.